So to begin, I would really like to acknowledge the Bedegal people that are the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm sitting right now, where UNSW is situated, and to acknowledge this is the place where so much of the thinking and planning and data analysis associated with this project has been conducted. So I'd like to also pay my respects to elders past and present, and to extend my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are present with us today. Um, to continue the acknowledgements, I've decided to put the acknowledgements up front in my talk today because really the project that I'm going to be sharing with you and some of the outcomes has really been a very strong collaborative effort. So first of all, to acknowledge the participants who took part in the study, for their courage and generosity and trust in us, for sharing their stories and being willing to, get into an MRI scanner and to participate in the tasks we asked them to, and to acknowledge if there's any participants here today. So thank you so much. Also, this project was conducted in collaboration with STARTS, which has been such a privilege and an honour. So particularly like to thank Jorge, Miriana and Mariano, but also all of the incredible counsellors, administrative staff and others who work at STARTS who I've learned so much from and who supported and informed this project. I also like to acknowledge the collaborators at UNSW, particularly Richard Bryant, and there are other collaborators from the University of Sydney and also University of Melbourne, and it's very much a collaborative effort and between multiple institutions and with STARTS. So thank you. So the talk today is focused very much on the impact of torture on the brain, and unfortunately, torture continues to be practiced in over 141 countries around the world. 1 in 5 conflict-affected people are survivors of torture, and a large meta-analysis conducted by Zachary Steele found that torture exposure was the strongest predictor of PTSD amongst conflict-exposed individuals. Now, us and Jorge and many others have proposed some of the neurobiological processes that might be specifically affected in torture survivors. And these are focused on disruptions to emotion processing, dysregulation mechanisms, difficulties engaging in interpersonal processing and attachment systems, and perceptions of control. And we also do know that the mental health consequences of torture are multifaceted and appear to be distinct from other trauma. And so this very much has motivated the project that we undertook to better understand or to uncover some of the specific impacts of torture exposure on the brain. So what do we already know? So there has been a number of studies that have looked at the impacts of torture exposure on the structure and the functioning of the brain. So in terms of structural impacts, torture survivors have shown sort of more thinner cortex, reduced volumes of the brain, reduced connectivity in the brain. And functionally, it appears as though torture survivors show some differences in engaging in threat-related or emotion processing, as well as sort of very early sensory activation patterns. And it seems that the prefrontal cortex and its functioning appears to be particularly affected. Now, there are some methodological issues with these existing studies. One of the key ones is around the ways in which participants have been grouped. So most of the time, participants have been grouped. It's not distinct that considering the impact of torture itself, and hasn't been separated from the experience of other war-related traumatic events. And often it's conflated with the impact of PTSD or other types of post-traumatic sort of symptoms and the neural effects of those. So the separation and the specific effects of torture on the brain haven't been fully identified in these studies. There's also such a large range of methodology in terms of task and imaging or techniques to look at brain activity. And one thing that, has very much been a focus is on just looking at sort of the regions of the brain that are engaged in particular tasks. But we know that the brain works much more as a system, as a collection of networks that connect with one another in a very dynamic way. And so we're very interested in applying some more some more sort of systems or networks approaches to understanding how torture might affect sort of brain connectivity at a whole on a sort of a larger sort of level. So I'm going to talk about 5 studies today, and don't worry, I'm not going to be going into lots and lots of detail on each of them, but we'll talk about some of the outcomes because I'm really keen to um, feed back this to the community, to start a conversation around what are the implications of some of these results. So the 5 studies will consider sort of in a stepwise way the impact of torture exposure on firstly intrinsic functional network connectivity in the brain using a resting state brain scanning technique. We then can look at functional network connectivity in an active state. So what happens when people are looking at emotionally salient images? Then we look at specific threat and reward neurocircuitry and the impact of torture on that activation. Then taking sort of the next step, what is the impact of torture exposure on more explicit and regulation systems of the brain when people are actively trying to downregulate responses to um, emotionally threatening images. And then in the 5th study, we'll start looking at what is going on when people are trying to inhibit their responses and what's happening in terms of cognitive control. So to consider these questions for 4 years, from 2013 to 2016, we ran a neuroimaging project in collaboration with STARTS, in which over 150 participants with a refugee background participated in a series of functional MRI studies. It was a 3 sort of stage process. So participants were referred either from STARTS or via community or refugee services in Sydney. And then were invited to, first of all, a clinical interview, which usually took place in 2 sessions to enable a very in-depth informed consent process to make sure that potential participants were fully aware of what they was signing up for and what they sort of were able to do in terms of withdrawal and things like that. And then we did a clinical interview. So we assessed them current mental health symptoms and a whole variety of other mechanisms, and then as well as their trauma histories. So, and in particular, for those who endorsed that they had experienced torture, we looked at in more depth the experience of their torture exposure. And then the week following the second interview, participants came to Royal North Shore Hospital to participate in a MRI scan and did a number of different tasks inside the scanner. So in the first study, we were very much interested in how torture exposure affects the intrinsic functional network connectivity of the brain. And in particular, we're interested in how torture might affect 3 core networks that form what's known as a triple network model. And these networks have been proposed to understand the neural basis of cognitive and affective disorders, including in PTSD. And these are the default mode network, the central executive network, and the salience network. And I'll talk a bit about some of the functionalities of these networks in line with the actual results. So we hypothesized quite broadly that torture survivors would show differential connectivity within and between these networks compared to a control group comprising of trauma-exposed refugees but without torture exposure. So these were our participants. So this design allowed us to really pinpoint what the effect of the torture exposure was over and above other types of traumatic experiences that refugees might have faced. And so we had a final sample of 99 participants. We had to exclude 5 participants because of excess movement during the resting state scan. So the resting state scan is where participants were asked to simply lie and relax as much as they could inside the scanner, focus on the fixation point, and to just let their thoughts roam freely. And so in this sample, we had 37 survivors of torture and 62 non-torture survivors. And to verify torture exposure, we used the 3-step process. So first of all, we asked if participants had experienced themselves torture as part of the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire. And then if they endorsed that item, we conducted a semi-structured interview that we developed with input from STARTS to understand some of the details around the nature of their torture experience exposure. And then in the post interview phase, we completed the torture survivor checklist. And this is an evidence-based approach to verify whether or not people's experiences met the UN definition of torture. And so you can see here in our groups, we had a range of people from different countries of origin, but the largest cohort were from Iran in both groups. The PTSD severity was significantly higher in the torture survivor group, and the 40% had were diagnosed with PTSD, and 30% met diagnostic criteria for PTSD in the non-torture survivor group. And so for this particular analysis, we did control for age differences, other trauma exposure, irrespective of torture, and PTSD symptom severity. I have dissociative symptoms here reported because this is in relation to some of the post hoc analyses we did and in relation to the findings. And I'll explain that more in a moment. This is to show that the nature of the torture exposure of our participants was pretty extreme. So participants reported having experienced a range of events that over the 7 categories of torture according to the Istanbul Protocol, and more likely to report these experiences as being either multiple events or representing sustained exposure over prolonged periods of time. So for this particular analysis, we're interested in what is happening sort of in the brain during resting state. And to do this, we use a data-driven approach. And this used group spatial independence components analysis. What this allowed us to do is to, rather than impose our idea of what these networks should look like, we looked at what is actually being active or coactive in networks in the brain in our particular sample of 99 participants. And we identified 25 discrete networks this way, and 8 fell within our regions of interest. And these are these are shown here, displayed here. I note that there was no evidence of the salience network being engaged during the resting state in this particular cohort. Then what we did is look at what differences there were in these networks in terms of the connectivity between groups. So the first key finding was that there was specific group difference in the left central executive network, only this network. And this network comprises the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the posterior temporal regions. The torture survivor group showed less spectral power in the low frequency range in this network compared to the non-torture survivor group, control group. And this is controlling for these various factors that I mentioned before. What this indicates is that there is more interrupted long distance connectivity within the left central executive network in the torture survivor group compared to non-torture survivors. And the central executive network is really critical for directing attention, to what matters in our external environment. The next question we wanted to look at was, well, what about the connectivity between these networks? We found some very interesting group differences here. So we used dynamic functional network connectivity to analyze, look at this data. This is a powerful and highly replicable tool for mapping how networks integrate with one another and connect with one another over time. So over the time of the scan. So again, we found a key role for the left central executive network. The torture survivor group showed more positive connectivity between the left central executive network and the anterior, dorsal, and ventral components of default mode network. And this is shown here in the red arrows. So the positive connectivity between the networks suggests that as one network is active, the other is also active. And this positive coupling, which is more significant in the torture survivor group, suggests that there's tighter connections between these networks, and particularly between the lateral parts of the brain and the medial parts of the brain within the default mode network. The default mode network is a really critical network of the brain. It's responsible for internal self-referential processes and integrating sort of external events to our internal sense of self and developing sort of the construction of ourself, and really forms the basis of our social and emotional functioning. We also did find, though, that there was some patterns of negative coupling between, again, the left central executive network, the lateral frontal network, and the lateral frontal network and the anterior dorsal medial default mode network. And this is shown here in the blue arrows. So negative connectivity means that as one is sort of network is being more active, the other is relatively less active. So again, this sort of indicating some difficulties happening with how the networks are communicating with each other between the lateral prefrontal regions and between the lateral and medial parts of the brain. So in terms of the discussion and how we've interpreted some of these results, it suggests that the torture survivor group was showing differential connectivity, particularly in the left central executive network compared to the control groups, and that this might drive a functional imbalance between the lateral parts of the brain, the central executive network, and more of the medial parts of the brain represented the default mode network. Now, what's interesting is that there has been observed these patterns. Typically, in PTSD, these networks are less um, connected. But in the dissociative subtype of PTSD, these exact same networks are more hyperconnected, exactly like what you found. So we wanted to double check that the fact that the torture survivor group was showing more dissociative symptoms couldn't explain these results. And we found that they couldn't. So over and above, also controlling for dissociative symptoms, these patterns will still remain significant. And so overall, it suggests that there's disrupted internal external integration processing in the torture survivor group. And it's consistent with this idea of models that emphasize that this shutdown response is an adaptive function to torture exposure or any other types of interpersonal violence. And so at the time of experiencing these the torture or other types of interpersonal violations, the tendency is to start suppressing emotional reactivity, suppressing the sort of formation of these negative memories, and managing the arousal that's associated with experiencing these events, particularly if occurring over a prolonged period of time, as a form of coping and survival. But longer term and in the recovery phase or post-exposure phase, this might withdraw. These sort of patterns and sustained over time might result in more longer term withdrawal, emotional numbing, over-regulation of emotion, increased dissociation and inflexibility, as well as difficulty engaging interpersonally. So overall, these findings are suggesting that torture exposure has a long-term effect on the core functional architecture of the brain. So in the second study, and this I have to admit is something I've only just been analysing and looking at with my colleague Preetha Das, who's the expert really in the network analyses. So we've just finished this analysis yesterday, so it's very new. But I wanted to squeeze it into the presentation today because it's, I think, very interesting. Because what it allows us to do is, well, what is happening in terms the first study looked at what's happening when the brain's at rest, but what's happening in terms of functional connectivity in the brain when it's actually in an active state and responding to visually salient and emotional cues. And so our hypothesis was that torture survivors showed poorer connectivity in regions that were really important for processing and regulating emotional responses to visually important information. So in this task, we used a face processing task. This is quite a well-used paradigm for engaging emotional processes in the brain. And so participants viewed a series of faces, and they were just asked to view them. They weren't asked to respond to them in any way. So a series of, and the different emotions that we looked at were fear, as well as happy, shame, and sad, and compared to neutral. But in this particular analysis, we actually combined all of this data together to look at, well, what is going on, rather than looking at specific sort of networks that might be engaged to these emotions directly. We were interested in just what is happening when the brain is in this more active state of responding to emotional information. So what we've first found is that we actually used a slightly different method to look at this. We used what's called spatially constrained independence components analysis. And we looked at what was going on within these particular networks. So this is showing that these are the networks that were active in this particular sample of 99 participants. Oh, sorry, this is 83 participants who did the face perception task. When they were looking at these faces. And so there's activity in the subcortical networks, in the auditory networks, in sensory motor networks. The auditory networks are active because people are in a scanner, and if you ever had an MRI scan, it's quite noisy, so they're going to be engaged. The visual domain, within the cognitive control domain, in the default mode domain, as well as in the cerebellar domain. And so what we were interested in, well, are there group differences according to an exposure to torture? And so we had, in this particular sample, 35 torture survivors and 48 non-torture survivors. And this slide is showing where there are significant group differences. The red is where the torture survivors were showing increased activation compared to the non-torture survivor control group, and the blue activation patterns is where the torture survivor group was showing reduced activation in these networks compared to non-torture survivors groups. So first of all, I did want to focus on where there are reductions in the torture survivor group. So the torture survivor group was showing less engagement in the cognitive domain, in particular in the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, as seen here in the bottom sort of left corner, as well as in the default mode network, and particularly in the anterior cingulate, shown in the middle line here, and as well as parietal regions. Now, these are the regions that are traditionally used to support automatic emotion regulation and cognitive control. So the torture survivor groups were showing less activation in these parts of the brain when looking at emotional cues. But there were parts of the brain that were more active in the torture survivor group, and particularly in both in the same networks, but different parts of those networks. So within the default mode network domain, much more activation in the anterior prefrontal cortex and more medially located into the middle parts of the brain. And in the cognitive control domain, again in the prefrontal cortex, but also involving some of the medial temporal lobes, so the parahippocampal gyrus and the uncus. And this sort of suggests that there's potentially alternative regulatory processes that are being engaged in the torture survivor group, potentially to compensate. We don't really know. Or maybe they're trying to, the parahippocampal gyrus is often involved in more contextual processing. So maybe attempts to try to contextualize processes of these, and responses to these images. So I'm still trying to figure out what these results mean, but I'd be very keen to hear your reactions to them. So in general, the torture survivor group was showing different network activation to the emotional cues. So less activity in the core emotion regulation networks and regions of the brain, and more activity in more anterior and medial prefrontal regions. And I think it could suggest that torture survivors are engaging in alternative emotion processing parts of the brain. Is this a compensatory activity? We don't know. And this may require some more sort of direct experimental designs to investigate this. But it certainly suggests that, again, that torture has a long-term effect on how the brain is functionally connected when responding to emotionally salient information. So in the third study, and I've only presented this very briefly for context because I've actually presented some of the results of this in a previous research symposium a few years ago. But this study we're particularly interested in, well, what happens to particular emotional cues? So to fear cues compared to reward cues. And so we used again the face perception paradigm. And we focused on just in this particular analysis, just on male participants because the majority of the torture survivor group were males, and so we wanted to focus just on the males for this sample. And so the first key finding was that the torture survivor group showed reduced activity in the ventral striatum in response to the happy faces. Now, the ventral striatum is a really core part of the brain that's part of the reward systems of the brain. And we found that it was reduced in the torture survivor group, particularly with higher levels of PTSD symptoms, in particularly avoidance symptoms. We didn't see any relationship with PTSD symptoms in terms of how the brain responded to the fear phases in the torture survivor group. The second kind of key finding was that the torture survivor group showed greater decreases in hippocampal activation to both the fear and the happy faces with higher levels of trauma. Now, the hippocampus, of course, is a critical part of the brain in terms of facilitating learning, memory, and fear responses, highly sensitive to trauma and to stress. It's not really that surprising that we see greater or decreases in terms of its engagement to both fear and happy faces in the torture survivor group. We did see, though, that there was also stronger coupling between the hippocampal activation and sort of prefrontal regions, parietal, temporal regions, and other subcortical networks like the thalamus in the torture survivor group compared to the non-torture survivor group. Sort of, they didn't see any connectivity differences in terms of how the hippocampus is engaged into response to happy faces. So the implications of this study does suggest that there is, again, this long-term effect of torture, but particularly in different ways on fear and reward circuitries of the brain, and particularly potentially in terms of how, in terms of interpersonal processing responses. So in the fourth study, we were much more interested at this point to start thinking about, well, what happens when there is explicit instructions to down-regulate emotional responses, to control emotional reactions to significant information. And so in this study, we investigated emotion regulation systems in survivors of torture and how PTSD diagnosis and symptoms might interact with this. So our first hypothesis was that torture survivors with PTSD would show poorer downregulation of emotion, as evidenced by increased amygdala activation and decrease anterior cingulate and prefrontal cortical engagement to threat cues. And in the second hypothesis, we were interested in how there might be sort of differential moderation of these activation patterns, depending on the type of symptom profiles that people were presenting with. And I'll talk a little bit more about why we started to look at this as well. So this is our paradigm. So this is a very traditional emotion regulation task that has been used time and time again in many sort of healthy cohorts as well as PTSD and other psychological disorders. So in our particular case, we actually took people outside of the scanner and to give them a break, and also to talk to them about this paradigm and what we required them to do, because we are instructing them to implement cognitive reappraisal, which is not often sort of intuitive to many people, in terms of sort of when being instructed to do it. And so we trained the participants in the cognitive reappraisal through instruction, through some practice trials and some feedback outside of the scanner. And this really focused on down regulating emotional reactions, to visual cues of visual negative cues. So people who didn't demonstrate sufficient understanding of these instructions were um, excluded from the analysis, and this was 4 participants. So in this task, they were either instructed to think differently about the cues, and that's the cognitive reappraisal component, or just to watch the cues naturally. And so after that, they were presented with the emotional image, and these were sort of standardized images drawn from in standardized pictorial set that's used commonly in these sorts of tasks. Then they were asked to give a rating of how their emotional responses to this stimuli. And then they were asked again to watch, and then they were looked at a neutral scene. And this was just as to reset people, their brains for the next trial. And the analysis really compared what was happening in the brain when people were thinking differently about the image compared to watching naturally about the negative image. And so what we first wanted to look at, well, is there a torture exposure by PTSD diagnosis interaction? And so to do this, we did a full factorial analysis, and what the statistical software that we use, SPM12, and we found there was no differences in brain activation patterns for PTSD diagnosis. We did find that torture survivors showed reduced activity in the right inferior temporal gyrus compared to non-torture survivor groups, but that was the only area that showed any differences between the groups. And it's not within our sort of regions of interest that thought would be involved. And we did not find there was any interaction effect between the torture exposure and PTSD diagnosis. And so this sort of is kind of bringing us up to thinking about, well, why is this the case? And I think partly it's the case that the diagnostic threshold for PTSD is rather arbitrary when we're looking at the post-traumatic sort of the whole dimension spread of symptoms that people might be experiencing. And certainly within our sample, there were significant numbers of people with more subsyndromal PTSD still experiencing significant PTSD symptoms, but not quite meeting the diagnostic cutoff. And so we thought, we need to start looking at this in a much more sort of nuanced way. And so one of the things we thought to look at was to, look at PTSD symptoms in sort of 2 clusters. So to sort of recognize the fact that PTSD is also very heterogeneous. And so we were interested in that there seems to be a lot of support for 2 latent factors of PTSD, even though the diagnostic criteria under DSM-5 has 4 key clusters of symptoms. But 2 latent factors have emerged, and one is sort of a cluster of fear symptoms, including the re-experiencing, active avoidance, hyperarousal symptoms, and a cluster of dysphoria symptoms, including some of the emotional numbing symptoms, withdrawal, sleep problems, and concentration difficulties, and so forth. Now, in some of the work that Richard Bryan has done, he's found that in terms of treatment prediction studies, is that using the fMRI, that emotion perception brain markers, for example, the left insular engagement to fear and sad faces predicted decreases in fear symptoms post-treatment, but not dysphoria symptoms. And in another study, he found that response inhibition brain markers, including regions within the parietal cortex, predicted decreases in dysphoria symptoms, but not fear symptoms. And so this sort of suggests that there may be some value in considering, well, what are there sort of different correlates according to symptom profiles in our torture survivor group? And when we did the analysis, we found that indeed there was value because of the striking findings that we found. So what we found was that when we looked at the specific correlations between torture survivor and non-torture survivor groups with fear symptomatology, we found that those who were experiencing stronger fear PTSD symptoms, the torture survivor group showed overall reduced activity across the brain, including in core emotion regions, including insula and the hippocampus, and in regulatory parts of the brain, the dorsal-anterior cingulate and the medial prefrontal cortex. So they're showing underregulation profiles in response to the fear symptoms, in association with stronger fear symptoms. When we then looked at the association with dysphoria symptoms, we found the inverse pattern. So that those who were experiencing stronger dysphoria symptoms, the torture survivor group, showed increased activation when reappraising these negative images across the brain in some of the similar areas. So in the insula, in the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex, again, the dorsal anterior cingulate and the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. And what does this sort of suggest? Is actually consistent with an opponent regulation, emotion regulation neural profile, but which differs between torture survivor groups dependent on fear and dysphoria symptom patterns. And actually, it's according with some more recent evidence to suggest that there are opponent neural processes by symptom clusters in PTSD in the brain. And in our case, the fear as PTSD cluster is associated with an underregulation emotion profile in torture survivors, and dysphoria PTSD symptoms were associated with an overregulation neural profile, so more activation, so and facilitating like emotional withdrawal and so forth. So these findings somewhat could indicate that and provide support that it's important to tailor treatment to specific symptom presentations. And I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of after the next study. But overall, it does suggest that torture exposure affects how the brain recruits emotion down regulation, top-down systems of the brain, but depending on whether the torture survivors were experiencing more PTSD symptoms or more dysphoria symptoms. Okay, you might be relieved I'm up to the last study. So the last study was really very much focused on how whether or not torture survivors demonstrated differences in making in response inhibition processes where in the brain. And we predicted that torture survivors would show evidence of this heightened over control that we were seeing in some of the other studies, particularly in the first study where we found that left central executive network was particularly over engaged with the default mode network, so over controlling. And so to do this, we conducted a Go-NoGo paradigm, and you may be well familiar with this paradigm. It's very well evidenced for engaging sort of engaging prepotent motor responses and then asking people to inhibit those responses. And so assesses the capacity to exert cognitive control over motor responses. So in our Go trials, participants were asked to press a button when they saw an X stimulus. And this was seen for 84% of the trials. And in the No-Go trials, participants were asked not to press the button if they saw the K stimulus. And so we had 83 participants do this. And again, we're interested in looking at this from a network perspective. So what we first found was that during response inhibition, so when people were asked to, so in the No-Go trials, so they were actively stopping their response, that we found that, the right ventral anterior cingulate cortex was more engaged in the non-torture control group compared to the torture survivor group. And this part of the brain is really important for part of the response inhibition sort of network of the brain, as well as being part of emotion processing and downregulation systems. So it suggests that there is some difficulty in doing and sort of responding to regulate sort of inhibiting responses to the no-go trials in the torture survivor group. So next of all, we looked at some of the within network connectivity patterns. And what we found here was that the torture survivor group showed reduced connectivity in the posterior default mode network, and particularly within the precuneus, and in the auditory motor network, particularly the superior temporal gyrus, which suggests that there's just less connectivity within these networks in torture survivors when they're making, during this task. We also found that between network connectivity patterns were also reduced in the torture survivor group, particularly between attentional networks, so the dorsal attentional network and dorsomedial prefrontal networks, which are important for down-regulating responses. But what was interesting is that we didn't find that there was any differences between the groups in terms of their overall number of correct responses to the trials and incorrect or errors, errors of commission or errors of omission. So pressing when they shouldn't be or not pressing when they should be. So there's no behavioral differences. And so what this suggests is that torture survivors show differential response inhibition activity patterns compared to non-torture survivors. And this was demonstrated in reduced connectivity in key attentional control networks, in prefrontal auditory and motor networks, and also evidence of less right ventral anterior cingulate engagement in response inhibition trials. And this has been found to be a really critical part of the brain, important for successful response inhibition in general. And in particular, between this intersection between emotion and motor processing during the Go-NoGo in a healthy sample. So this study suggests that torture exposure impacts on the neural substrates of response inhibition and cognitive control mechanisms in an active task. So I just wanted to summarize the key findings across the 5 studies, because I recognize there's a lot of brain data and a lot of information. And to be honest, I'm still trying to think about how these all connect with one another. And it'd be great if you have any thoughts and ideas about that. The first study found that torture trauma has a long-term effect on brain functioning and connectivity, particularly in intrinsic brain networks, especially the left central executive network, and how the left central executive network connected with the default mode network. The second study found that torture trauma was associated with differential recruitment of functional networks in the brain during general emotion processing, and suggesting that torture survivors may be recruiting alternate prefrontal systems to process emotional cues. The third study suggests specifically that torture survivors modulated hippocampal activation to both fear and happy faces, depending on the level of trauma they had experienced, and also showed there was reduced engagement in reward circuitry of the brain to social reward cues, depending on the level of PTSD. In the fourth study, we found evidence of opponent brain activity patterns when down-regulating negative emotions, according to whether or not torture survivors were exhibiting more fear symptoms or more dysphoric PTSD symptoms. And finally, we found that the torture trauma was associated with reduced activity in the right ventral anterior cingulate and reduced connectivity between attentional networks when inhibiting motor responses. I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit about some of the limitations of our studies, and there are several. So one of the things is that our sample is really a mixture of both treatment seeking and a community sample. We didn't include a non-refugee control group to isolate the role of refugee status, because our study was really set up to understand the specific effects of torture. But a lot of people do ask us about, well, can you understand the effects of the refugee experience? And we can to some extent, but we don't have a non-refugee control group. And compared to the non-torture survivors, it was a relatively modest sample of torture survivors, but still, the highest sort of so far, so one of the highest so far in the world. So in terms of the treatment that participants were on, their treatment was stable, but at the time of the scan, in terms of any medications they were on, or in terms of any psychotherapy treatment, but we didn't wash out any their particular treatment. But we found in many of the analyses that whether people are on psychotropic medications, for example, didn't actually impact on the analyses, the results in any significant way. One of the complex aspects of doing research with refugees is just the sheer complexity of of psychological comorbidities that people present with, as well as the complexity of the current contextual stress that they might be experiencing in Australia. And so in some ways we did control for these things, but of course they could be contributing in a myriad of different ways to the patterns that we are seeing. And our studies are experimental, and so in some ways, so in some of them anyway, and that's very helpful to understand some of sort of the factors that might be driving these brain system differences in torture survivors, but overall they're still correlational, and so we can't really assume the causality. And so just thinking about some of the broader treatment implications, I'm sure they will be of interest to this group, and I'd love to talk more about this because it's something I'm still thinking about and thinking through. Certainly it suggests that torture has a long-term effect on all levels of emotion and cognitive functioning, not just on fear systems of the brain. That does suggest that torture exposure affects brain functional systems in specific ways, suggesting that survivors require specialized treatment. And the findings also suggest that the value of tailoring treatment to specific symptom presentations, which correlate with the different behaviors and brain patterns. So, for example, based on our emotion regulation study, fear symptoms were associated with poorer regulation, engagement of regulatory systems, which is what is usually targeted in trauma-focused DBT, for example. It's about bringing those regulation systems and sort of back online and to strengthen them. But those who present with more of dysphoric symptom profile might benefit more from a treatment approach that is about re-engaging or reorienting emotion recognition systems or emotion awareness processes. But there's lots to still unpack about this. In terms of future directions, so we're still processing some of the outcomes from this study, our project, and are now focusing on some of the social attachment differences between the torture survivors. I'm very much interested in applying some more of the neurocomputational methods, including more neural network and machine learning approaches to understand some of the more complex interactions between the different factors that influence psychopathology in refugees and in torture survivors. There's also the potential to combine fMRI insights with other neurobiological and psychophysiological insights, such as EEG or stress hormone release, etc. And one of the things I'm really keen to start really thinking about is we're talking very much in terms of it. The way I've been thinking about it is much more in terms of a deficit approach, but really start thinking about, well, what are the neural correlates of the sort of strengths approach, so how people are adapting to the situation of having been exposed to torture, and what factors at the brain level contribute to resilience. In terms of sort of broader applications, in thinking through, well, what is the relevance of these neuroscience insights into informing intervention, but also in terms of informing policy. It could, of course, assist in treatment selection, but it might even lead to innovations in the design of treatments and delivery of treatments and testing of new interventions. And also sort of from a broader perspective of how these insights might contribute to informing evidence-based policy development, in terms of protecting the interests of survivors of torture, and even in terms of, sort of the big goal of prevention. So thank you very much. That's the end.